Sarah Mitchell never imagined that walking her dog at midnight would change her life forever. The 28-year-old nurse from London had been working double shifts at the hospital for weeks, and the late-night walks with her golden retriever, Buddy, were her only escape from the chaos of her demanding job. It was a crisp October evening when she decided to take a different route through the quiet streets near Buckingham Palace. The area was usually deserted at this hour, with only the occasional tourist snapping photos through the palace gates. Sarah enjoyed the peaceful atmosphere, far from the noise and stress of the emergency ward where she spent most of her days. As she rounded the corner near the palace entrance, Buddy suddenly pulled on his leash and bounded toward the ornate gates. Sarah hurried after him, apologizing profusely as she saw her dog had approached one of the king's guards who stood motionless at his post. The guard, dressed in his traditional red uniform and tall black hat, remained perfectly still despite Buddy's enthusiastic tail wagging. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, trying to pull Buddy away. "He's usually much better behaved than this." The guard, whose name tag read James, didn't move a muscle, but Sarah caught a glimpse of his eyes behind the shadow of his hat. They were kind eyes, she thought, with tiny wrinkles at the corners that suggested he was fighting back a smile. She had heard that the guards weren't supposed to break their stance for anything, but something about this particular guard seemed different. "Come on, Buddy," she said, tugging gently at the leash. As she bent down to scoop up her dog, she noticed the guard's hand move slightly. It was barely perceptible, but his fingers seemed to be making a small gesture toward her. Sarah looked up, confused, and saw those same kind eyes looking directly at her now. Without thinking, she stepped closer to the gate. The guard's lips moved almost imperceptibly, and she heard the faintest whisper. "Same time tomorrow?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Was one of the king's guards actually speaking to her? She glanced around nervously, making sure no supervisors or other guards were watching. The area was completely empty except for them. What?" she whispered back, not sure if she had heard correctly. The guard's eyes crinkled slightly, confirming her suspicions that he was indeed smiling beneath his stoic exterior. "Tomorrow night? Same time?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. Sarah felt a flutter of excitement mixed with disbelief. This was completely unexpected and probably against every rule in the book for a royal guard. But something about the moment felt magical, like a scene from a fairy tale. "Okay," she whispered back, her cheeks flushing pink despite the cool night air. The next evening, Sarah found herself walking the same route with Buddy, her heart racing as they approached the palace gates. She had spent the entire day thinking about the mysterious guard, wondering if she had imagined the whole encounter. Maybe it was just her overactive imagination playing tricks on her after too many late shifts. But there he was, standing at the same post, looking as official and unmovable as ever. This time, however, Sarah was prepared. She deliberately let Buddy wander closer to the gates, giving her an excuse to approach. "Good evening," she whispered as she pretended to struggle with Buddy's leash. "Evening," came the barely audible reply. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I wasn't sure either," Sarah admitted, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "This is probably the strangest conversation I've ever had." She could see his shoulders shake slightly with silent laughter. "For me, too. I'm James, by the way." "Sarah?" she replied, feeling increasingly bold. "How long have you been doing this job?" 3 years, he whispered. "And in all that time, I've never broken protocol like this." "Why now?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. James was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the empty street before returning to her face. "Because you looked like someone who needed a friend. And honestly, so did I." Sarah felt her heart melt a little at his words. There was something incredibly touching about this strong, disciplined man admitting to loneliness, She had been feeling isolated herself lately, working long hours and coming home to an empty apartment with only Buddy for company. "What time do you finish your shift?" she found herself asking. 2 in the morning, James replied. "But I can't leave my post until then." Sarah glanced at her watch. It was only midnight. "I could wait," she said impulsively, then immediately felt foolish for suggesting such a thing. "You don't have to do that," James said, but she could hear the hope in his whispered words. "I want to," Sarah realized as she said it. "I don't have anywhere else to be." For the next 2 hours, Sarah sat on a nearby bench with Buddy curled up beside her, occasionally walking past the gates to exchange whispered words with James. She learned that he was 30 years old, originally from Manchester, and had joined the King's Guard after serving in the regular army. He told her about the rigorous training, the long hours of standing perfectly still, and the strange satisfaction he found in the discipline and tradition of his role. Sarah shared stories about her work as a nurse, the challenging patients she dealt with, and her dreams of traveling the world someday. Despite the unusual circumstances of their conversation, she felt more connected to this stranger than she had to anyone in months. As 2 o'clock approached, Sarah watched as another guard arrived for the shift change. James performed the ceremonial handover with perfect precision, but as he prepared to leave his post, his eyes found Sarah's one more time. "Wait for me by the coffee shop on the corner," he whispered as he passed by her bench. Sarah's heart pounded as she gathered Buddy and walked to the small 24-hour cafe James had indicated. She ordered 2 cups of coffee and sat by the window, wondering if he would actually show up. Part of her expected him to disappear into the night, leaving her with nothing but a strange and wonderful memory. But 15 minutes later, James walked through the cafe door, now dressed in civilian clothes. Without his uniform, he looked younger and more approachable, though still unmistakably handsome with his military bearing and warm smile. "I can't believe I just did that," he said as he sat down across from her, accepting the coffee she offered. "Which part?" Sarah asked with a grin. "Breaking protocol or agreeing to have coffee with a complete stranger at 2 in the morning?" "Both," James laughed, and the sound sent warmth spreading through Sarah's chest. "My commanding officer would probably court-martial me if he knew." "Then why did you do it?" Sarah asked, studying his face in the soft light of the cafe. James looked down at his coffee cup, suddenly serious. "Because sometimes you meet someone and you just know that walking away would be the biggest mistake of your life." Sarah felt her breath catch at his words. "And you think I'm one of those people?" "I hope so," James said, looking up at her with those same kind eyes that had first caught her attention. "I really hope so." They talked until sunrise, sharing stories and laughter as the city slowly woke up around them. By the time they parted ways, promising to meet again the next night, Sarah knew that something fundamental had shifted in her world. She had no idea that their budding romance would soon capture the attention of millions, or that their simple midnight encounter would spark a media frenzy that would change both of their lives forever. As she walked home with Buddy trotting beside her, Sarah couldn't stop smiling. For the first time in months, she felt truly alive and hopeful about the future. The mysterious guard who had whispered to her through the palace gates had awakened something in her heart that she thought had been lost forever. Little did she know that a paparazzi photographer, hoping to catch late-night celebrity activity near the palace, had captured their entire first encounter on camera. The photos, showing Sarah and James in intimate conversation through the palace gates, were already being uploaded to tabloid websites across the country. By the time Sarah woke up that afternoon, her face was on the front page of 3 different newspapers, and her quiet life as an unknown nurse was about to become a very public affair. Sarah's phone was ringing non-stop when she finally woke up at 3 in the afternoon. Groggily, she reached for it, expecting to see her sister's name or perhaps a call from the hospital about picking up an extra shift. Instead, her screen showed dozens of missed calls from unknown numbers and a flood of text messages from friends and family. The first text she opened was from her best friend Emma. "Sarah, please tell me you've seen the news. Call me immediately." Confused and still half asleep, Sarah stumbled to her laptop and opened her browser. The first headline that appeared made her blood run cold. "Royal Guard's secret midnight romance exposed." Below it was a crystal-clear photograph of her and James whispering through the palace gates, Buddy sitting loyally at her feet. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through article after article, each one speculating wildly about her identity and her relationship with the unnamed guard. Some tabloids had already identified her as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, and one particularly invasive piece included details about her apartment building and even her work schedule. Her phone rang again, this time showing her mother's number. Sarah answered with shaking fingers. "Sarah, darling, what on earth is going on?" Her mother's worried voice came through the speaker. "Your father just called me in a panic. He said you're all over the internet with some soldier." "Mom, I can explain," Sarah began, but she wasn't sure how to put the magical evening into words that wouldn't sound completely insane. "Are you safe? Should we come to London? Oh, Sarah, there are reporters calling the house asking questions about you." Sarah felt her world spinning out of control. In less than 12 hours, her private life had become public property, and she hadn't even had a chance to process what was happening between her and James, let alone explain it to her family. Meanwhile, across London, James was facing his own nightmare. He had been called into his commanding officer's office at 9 that morning, where Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk with a stack of newspapers spread across its surface. "Care to explain this, Sergeant Mitchell?" the colonel asked, his voice dangerously calm as he held up the front page of the Daily Mail showing James and Sarah at the palace gates. James stood at attention, his heart sinking as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. "Sir, I can explain." "You can explain how you violated every protocol we have? How you've brought embarrassment to the King's Guard and potentially compromised the security of Buckingham Palace?" The colonel's voice rose with each word. "It wasn't planned, sir. She was just walking her dog and we started talking. I know it was wrong, but—" "Wrong?" Colonel Harrison stood up abruptly. "Sergeant, this goes beyond wrong. This is a complete breach of duty. Do you realize that your little romantic adventure is now front-page news across the country? We've had to implement additional security measures because reporters are swarming the palace trying to get more pictures." James felt sick to his stomach, not just because of the professional consequences he was facing, but because he realized that Sarah was probably going through something similar. She hadn't asked for any of this attention, and now she was being dragged through the media circus because of his decision to break protocol. "Sir, the civilian involved didn't know she was being photographed. She shouldn't have to suffer because of my mistake," James said, trying to protect Sarah even as his own career crumbled around him. "That's very noble of you, Sergeant, but it's too late for that now. The damage is done." The colonel sat back down and rubbed his temples. "I'm suspending you from duty pending a full investigation. You'll surrender your uniform and remain available for questioning. And Sergeant, if I were you, I'd stay far away from Miss Mitchell until this blows over." James left the meeting feeling devastated. He had not only destroyed his own career, but had dragged an innocent woman into a media storm. The worst part was that he couldn't even contact Sarah to apologize or explain what was happening on his end. Back at her apartment, Sarah was learning just how intrusive media attention could be. Reporters had somehow found her address and were camped outside her building. She couldn't leave without being bombarded with questions and camera flashes. Her hospital had called to inform her that she was being placed on temporary leave while they dealt with the situation, which meant she couldn't even escape to the familiar comfort of her work. Emma had come over to help Sarah deal with the chaos, bringing groceries and moral support. She found her friend sitting on the floor of her living room, surrounded by newspaper clippings, and her laptop open to yet another article about her scandalous romance. "They're calling it the most romantic story of the year," Emma said, trying to inject some positivity into the situation as she read over Sarah's shoulder. "Look, this one says you're like a modern-day Cinderella." "I don't feel like Cinderella," Sarah said miserably. "I feel like I've ruined someone's life. James could lose his job because of me." "Because of you?" "Sarah, you were just walking your dog. This isn't your fault." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was. If she hadn't approached the palace gates, if she hadn't encouraged the conversation, if she hadn't agreed to wait for James after his shift, none of this would have happened. 3 days into the media frenzy, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of hiding away until the story died down, she decided to take control of the narrative. She contacted the BBC and offered to give one exclusive interview to set the record straight. The interview took place in her apartment, with Sarah wearing a simple blue dress and Buddy lying quietly at her feet. The interviewer, a kind woman named Catherine Phillips, had promised to focus on the human side of the story rather than sensationalizing it. "Sarah, the whole country is fascinated by your story," Catherine began. "Can you tell us how you're feeling about all this attention?" Sarah took a deep breath before answering. "Honestly, it's been overwhelming. I never expected that a simple conversation would lead to all of this. I'm not used to being in the public eye, and I certainly never wanted to cause trouble for anyone." "Do you regret meeting James?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I can't regret meeting someone who made me feel hope and happiness again, but I do regret that our private moment was made public without our consent, and I deeply regret any professional consequences James might face because of it." "Have you been able to speak with James since the story broke?" "No," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "I understand he's been suspended from duty. And I'm sure he's been advised not to contact me. I just want him to know that I don't blame him for any of this, and I hope his superiors will consider the fact that he's been an exemplary soldier who made one human mistake." "What would you say to people who are criticizing you for distracting a guard from his duty?" Sarah's eyes flashed with a hint of anger. "I would say that guards are human beings, not robots. James never abandoned his post or neglected his duty. We simply had a conversation during a quiet moment. If that makes me a villain in some people's eyes, then I suppose they've never experienced loneliness or the unexpected joy of connecting with another person." The interview was broadcast that evening and immediately changed public opinion about the situation. Instead of seeing Sarah as a troublemaker who had corrupted a royal guard, viewers saw her as an ordinary woman who had found herself in an extraordinary situation through no fault of her own. The response was overwhelming. Sarah's phone was flooded with supportive messages from strangers, and social media erupted with hashtags like #DasShot, Let Them Love, and Justice for James and Sarah. People began sharing their own stories of unexpected romance and defending the couple's right to privacy and happiness. A petition was started demanding that James be reinstated to his position, and within 24 hours, it had gathered over 100,000 signatures. Celebrity supporters began speaking out in favor of the couple, and even members of parliament were weighing in on what had become a national conversation about privacy, duty, and the right to love. James watched the interview from his small flat, feeling his heart break and soar simultaneously. Sarah had been incredible, defending him even though they barely knew each other and taking responsibility for something that wasn't her fault. Her grace under pressure and her obvious care for his well-being made him realize that his initial instinct had been right. She was exactly the kind of person worth taking risks for. But the attention was also taking its toll on both of them. Sarah had been forced to move in with Emma temporarily after reporters made her own apartment uninhabitable. James was under investigation and facing the possibility of losing not just his current position, but his entire military career. As the story continued to dominate headlines, both Sarah and James began to wonder if their brief moment of connection had been worth the chaos that followed. Neither of them could have predicted that their story was about to take an even more dramatic turn, one that would capture the hearts of millions around the world and prove that sometimes love really can conquer all. 2 weeks after the story broke, something unexpected happened that would change everything for Sarah and James. The king himself requested a private meeting with both of them at Buckingham Palace. Sarah could hardly believe it when she received the formal invitation, delivered by a palace courier to Emma's apartment where she had been staying. The elegant card, bearing the royal coat of arms, requested her presence for a private audience regarding recent events of public interest. James received a similar invitation, though his came through military channels with orders to report to the palace at the specified time. Both of them were told to bring no media, no representatives, and no recording devices. On the appointed morning, Sarah dressed in her most conservative outfit and arrived at the palace gates with her hands trembling. She was escorted through corridors she had only seen in documentaries, past priceless artwork and centuries of royal history. The whole experience felt surreal, like she was walking through a dream. James arrived separately, wearing his dress uniform despite his suspension. He looked exactly as handsome and dignified as Sarah remembered, though she could see the strain of the past 2 weeks in the tightness around his eyes. When they saw each other in the elegant waiting room, they exchanged nervous smiles but didn't dare speak, unsure of the protocol for their extraordinary situation. A royal aide appeared and led them to a surprisingly modest office where the king waited behind a simple wooden desk. He was smaller than Sarah had expected and much more approachable, dressed in a casual suit rather than formal royal attire. "Please sit down," the king said warmly, gesturing to 2 chairs placed in front of his desk. "I apologize for the unusual circumstances, but your story has reached my attention in a way that I felt required a personal response." Sarah and James sat stiffly, both overwhelmed by the surreal nature of finding themselves face to face with the monarch because of their midnight conversation. "Your Majesty," James began, "I want to apologize for any embarrassment I've caused to the Crown or the King's Guard. My behavior was unprofessional, and I take full responsibility." The king held up a hand to stop him. "Sergeant Mitchell, I've reviewed your service record extensively over the past 2 weeks. 3 years of exemplary duty, commendations from your superiors, and not a single mark against you until this incident. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," James replied, confused about where this was heading. "And Miss Mitchell," the king turned to Sarah, "I understand you work as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. 12-hour shifts in the emergency ward, volunteer work with homeless shelters, and according to your supervisor, one of the most dedicated healthcare workers they've ever employed." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The king leaned back in his chair and smiled. "So what we have here are 2 exemplary citizens who happened to meet under unusual circumstances and whose private moment was exploited by the media without their consent." Sarah and James exchanged glances, still not sure what point the king was making. "I've been following the public response to your story," the king continued. "The outpouring of support has been remarkable. Tens of thousands of people demanding that Sergeant Mitchell be reinstated. Millions of social media messages defending your right to privacy and happiness, and even international media coverage portraying this as a beautiful love story that gives people hope." The king stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. "You know, in my position, I see a lot of the darker side of human nature. Political maneuvering, scandal, betrayal. But occasionally something comes along that reminds me why this institution exists to serve the people. Your story has done that." He turned back to face them. The monarchy has always been about tradition, duty, and service. But it's also about recognizing that the people who serve the crown are human beings with hearts and dreams and the right to happiness. Sergeant Mitchell, you made an error in judgment, but you've also shown that beneath the uniform, you're a man with a heart. That's not something to be ashamed of. James felt his throat tighten with emotion. Thank you, Your Majesty, but I understand that my actions have consequences. Indeed they do, the king agreed. Which is why I've made some decisions that I hope will turn those consequences into something positive. The king returned to his desk and picked up 2 documents. Sergeant Mitchell, you are hereby reinstated to the King's Guard, effective immediately. Your suspension is lifted, and this incident will not appear on your permanent record. James's mouth fell open in shock. Your Majesty, I don't understand. Furthermore, the king continued, I'm implementing new guidelines that will allow guards more flexibility in interacting with the public during quiet periods, within reasonable bounds. Your case has highlighted that our protocols may have been unnecessarily rigid. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she watched James struggle to process this unexpected turn of events. And Miss Mitchell, the king said, turning to her, I understand that the media attention has disrupted your work at the hospital. Yes, sir. I've been placed on leave until things calm down, Sarah confirmed. That's unfortunate, because the country needs dedicated healthcare workers like you. I'm personally writing a letter to your hospital administration requesting that you be reinstated immediately, with a commendation for your service during this difficult period. Sarah gasped. Your Majesty, you don't need to do that. I want to do that, the king said firmly. But more importantly, I want to do something else. He gestured for them to follow him to a different part of the office, where comfortable chairs were arranged around a small table set with tea and biscuits. I want you to know that you have the crown's blessing to pursue whatever relationship you choose, the king said as they sat down. The palace will make a statement today, supporting both of you and asking the media to respect your privacy going forward. Sarah and James looked at each other with wonder and relief. For 2 weeks, they had been afraid to even speak to each other, and now the king himself was giving them permission to explore their feelings. There is one thing I'd like to ask of you, the king added with a slight smile. Your story has captured the imagination of millions of people around the world. They see in you a reminder that love can bloom in the most unexpected places and that ordinary people can find extraordinary happiness. Would you be willing to let the palace share your story in a positive way? What do you mean? Sarah asked. I mean allowing a palace photographer to take some official photos of you together, perhaps participating in a charity event that showcases both of your service to others. Nothing invasive or overly public, but something that allows people to see the real story behind the headlines. James and Sarah looked at each other, communicating silently in the way that people do when they're beginning to understand each other's thoughts. We'd be honored, Sarah said finally. If it can help other people believe in love and hope, then something good will have come from all of this. 3 months later, Sarah and James were featured on the cover of a major magazine, photographed at a charity gala where James was volunteering his time to help veterans and Sarah was raising money for hospital equipment. The headline read, "A Love That Moved Millions, Where Are They Now?" The article inside told the story of how their relationship had blossomed after the king's intervention. They had taken things slowly, dating properly, and getting to know each other away from the media spotlight. James had returned to his duties as a King's Guard, but was also pursuing a degree in social work, inspired by Sarah's dedication to helping others. Sarah had gone back to her job at the hospital, but she had also started a blog about finding hope and connection in unexpected places. Her writing had gained a massive following, with people from around the world sharing their own stories of unexpected love and friendship. The couple had also become advocates for mental health awareness, speaking openly about how the media attention had affected them and how they had supported each other through the difficult times. They had used their platform to raise money for various charities and had become symbols of how love could thrive even under the most challenging circumstances. 6 months after that magazine cover, James proposed to Sarah in the same spot where they had first met, outside the palace gates at midnight. This time, however, they weren't alone. A small crowd of well-wishers had gathered, alerted by social media posts, and when Sarah said yes, the cheers could be heard for blocks around. Their wedding was a modest affair, held in a small church in Sarah's hometown, but the guest list included the king himself, who had become a personal friend and supporter of their relationship. The ceremony was live-streamed by the BBC, and millions of people around the world watched as the nurse and the king's guard exchanged vows. In her wedding speech, Sarah spoke about how one moment of courage to speak to a stranger had changed everything for her. "People ask me if I regret that midnight walk with Buddy," she said, glancing at her faithful dog who was wearing a small bow tie for the occasion. "But how could I regret something that led me to the love of my life and showed me that fairy tales really can come true?" James, in his response, thanked the king for his wisdom and support, but mostly he thanked Sarah for seeing beyond the uniform to the man underneath. "You taught me that duty to the crown doesn't mean giving up duty to my own heart," he said, "and you showed me that sometimes breaking the rules is exactly what you're supposed to do." Their story continued to inspire people years later. They had 2 children, both of whom grew up hearing the story of how their parents met through palace gates at midnight. James eventually left the king's guard to become a full-time social worker, while Sarah became the head of nursing at her hospital. But every year on the anniversary of their first meeting, they returned to Buckingham Palace for a midnight walk with Buddy, now graying around the muzzle, but still faithful. The current king's guards, who all knew their story, would nod respectfully as they passed, and sometimes one of them would whisper, "Good evening, your royal romantics," which had become their affectionate nickname among the palace staff. Sarah and James would always stop at the exact spot where they first spoke, and they would remember how one moment of human connection had grown into a love story that had touched millions of hearts around the world. It reminded them that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary moments, and that love really could conquer all if you had the courage to reach for it.